Marcus Thompson never expected that answering an emergency service call at 2:17 a.m. would change everything he thought he knew about his own life. What started as a routine elevator repair in downtown Portland would unravel a mystery that had been hidden for 32 years. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you. Make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The shrill ring of Marcus's emergency phone cut through the silence of his small apartment like a knife. He rolled over, squinting at the glowing numbers on his alarm clock. 2:17 a.m. In his 15 years as an elevator technician, these middle-of-the-night calls had become routine, but they never got easier. "Thompson Emergency Elevator Services," he answered, his voice still thick with sleep. "Thank God someone picked up," came a frantic voice on the other end. "This is Janet Walsh, building manager. At Riverside Towers on 5th Avenue. I've got people trapped in elevator car number 3. The system completely shut down about 20 minutes ago." Marcus was already pulling on his work clothes. "How many people are stuck?" "Just one that we know of. An elderly woman. She was coming home from the hospital and..." Janet's voice cracked. "Slightly, she's been through enough tonight. Can you get here quickly?" "I'll be there in 15 minutes, Marcus said, grabbing his toolbox and emergency kit. "Keep trying to talk to her through the intercom if you can. Let her know help is coming." The drive through Portland's empty streets was eerily quiet. Street lights cast long shadows as Marcus navigated toward downtown, his van's headlights cutting through the light drizzle that had started to fall. Riverside Towers was one of the older buildings in the city, built in the 1970s, with elevator systems that were temperamental on the best of days. When Marcus arrived, Janet Walsh was waiting. In the lobby, pacing back and forth, she was a woman in her 50s with graying hair pulled back in a messy bun, wearing a bathrobe over her clothes and clutching a cup of coffee like a lifeline. "Thank you for coming so quickly," she said, leading him toward the elevator bank. "Mrs. Patterson, that's the woman who's trapped. She just got back from visiting her husband at the hospital. He's been in intensive care for 3 weeks now." Marcus nodded, setting down his toolbox. "Which floor is she stuck between?" "Somewhere between the 4th and 5th floors." The car just stopped dead. The lights are still on inside, thank goodness. And the intercom is working. Marcus pressed the intercom button. "Mrs. Patterson, this is Marcus, the elevator technician. I'm here to get you out safely. Can you hear me?" A weak voice came through the speaker. "Yes, I can hear you. Thank you for coming. I'm sorry to be in such trouble." "No trouble at all, ma'am. I'm going to run some diagnostics and figure out exactly what's going on. It might take a little while, but I want you to know that you're completely safe. The elevator car is secure, okay?" came the reply, barely above a whisper. Marcus began his inspection, opening the elevator control panel in the basement. The building's electrical system was a maze of outdated wiring and patched repairs. As he traced the power lines with his multimeter, he could see evidence of years of quick fixes rather than proper maintenance. It was a wonder the elevators worked at all. "The main relay system has failed," he explained to Janet, who had followed him downstairs. "It's not just a simple reset. I'm going to have to bypass several circuits and manually override the safety systems to get her down safely."
"How long will that take?"
Marcus looked at the tangled mess of wires and switches. "At least an hour, maybe 2. This system is ancient." He worked. Marcus found himself thinking about the woman trapped above. There was something in her voice that reminded him of his own mother. A sadness that went deeper than just being stuck in an elevator. He'd heard Janet mention that her husband was in the hospital, and Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that Mrs. Patterson was dealing with more than just this mechanical crisis. "Mrs. Patterson?" He called through the intercom again. "How are you?" "Holding up, I'm fine, dear. Just tired. It's been a very long day." "I understand. Janet mentioned you were at the hospital. Hope everything's okay." There was a long pause before she responded. "My husband, Robert, he's not doing well. Doctors aren't sure he's going to make it through the week."
Marcus
Felt his chest tighten. He'd lost his own father to cancer 5 years earlier, and he remembered those long nights in hospital waiting rooms, the exhaustion that went bone deep, the feeling of helplessness that consumed everything. "I'm sorry to hear that," he said softly. "That must be incredibly difficult." 53 years we've been married, Mrs. Patterson continued, her voice gaining strength. We met when we were both 19. He was working construction then, building some of the first high-rises in this city. He always joked that he helped build the world I'd be living in. As Marcus continued working on the relay system, carefully, rerouting power through backup circuits, Mrs. Patterson's voice became his companion in the mechanical room. She told him about her husband's career, how he'd worked his way up from construction worker to project foreman, eventually starting his own small construction company that specialized in building maintenance and repairs. He always said that fixing things was more important than building new ones, she said. Anyone can put something together when all the parts are new and perfect, but it takes real skill to make something work again when it's broken. Marcus smiled as he spliced. A new connection. Sounds like a wise man. Was. I don't know what tense to use anymore. The work was painstaking. Each wire had to be tested, each circuit carefully mapped. Marcus discovered that someone had attempted repairs before, but they'd created more problems than they'd solved. Crossed connections, loose terminals, and bypass safety features had turned the elevator system into an electrical nightmare. Janet mentioned you've been doing this for 15 years, Mrs. Patterson said during one of their conversations. What? Do you enjoy the work? Marcus paused, considering the question. Most of the time, yes. There's something satisfying about solving mechanical puzzles, about taking something that's broken and making it work again. Though I have to admit, the middle of the night calls are getting harder as I get older. How old are you, if you don't mind me asking? 32? Oh my, Mrs. Patterson said, and Marcus could hear something shift in her voice. 32. That's exactly how old my son would have been. Marcus felt an unexpected chill run down his spine. Would it have been? We lost him when he was just a baby. A car accident Robert was driving. Her voice became very quiet. It nearly destroyed our marriage. Robert blamed himself for years. We never had other children after that, Marcus found, himself gripping his tools tighter. Something about this conversation was stirring up emotions he wasn't prepared for. His own adoption had always been a source of questions in his life. He'd been placed with the Thompsons when he was 3 years. Old, too young to remember much about his life before, but old enough to sometimes wonder about the family he'd lost. I'm sorry, he said. That must have been devastating. It was. But we got through it together. Robert used to say that losing David taught him that every day was a gift. Every moment was precious. He threw himself into his work after that, always trying to help people, always trying to fix what was broken. As Marcus worked deeper into the night, bypassing burned-out components and jury-rigging temporary solutions, he found himself drawn into Mrs. Patterson's stories. She told him about the early years of her marriage, about the small apartment they'd shared above a bakery, about Robert's dreams of building something lasting in the world. He had such gentle hands, she said at one point. You'd think a construction. The worker would have rough, calloused hands, but Robert's were always so gentle. He could fix anything. Watches, radios, even helped neighbors with their cars. But when he held me, or when he held David those precious few months we had him, his hands were like silk. Marcus paused in his work, looking down at his own hands. They were definitely rough and calloused from years of mechanical work, scarred from countless cuts and burns. But his adoptive mother had always commented on how gentle he was with delicate things, how he seemed to have an instinct for handling fragile mechanisms without damaging them. What did your son look like? Marcus asked, surprising himself with the question. Oh, he was beautiful. His dark hair like his father, brown eyes that seemed to take in everything. He had this little birthmark on his left shoulder, shaped like a crescent moon. Robert used to call it his lucky mark. Marcus's hand instinctively went to his left shoulder, where beneath his work shirt lay a crescent-shaped birthmark he'd carried his entire life. His adoptive parents had always said it made him unique, special. He'd never thought much about it, but now... Mrs. Patterson, Marcus said carefully. What was your maiden name? Anderson? Why do you ask? Marcus felt the world tilt slightly. Anderson had been his birth name, according to the adoption papers. Marcus Anderson, before he became Marcus Thompson. But thousands of people had the name Anderson. It had to be a coincidence. Where did the accident happen? He heard himself ask. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. On Highway 26, just outside the city, we were coming back from visiting Robert's mother. It was raining, and a truck ran a red light. Her voice trailed off. They told us David didn't survive the crash, but Robert did. He spent 3 months in the hospital recovering from his injuries. Marcus's hands were shaking now. Highway 26. He knew that stretch of road. And according to his adoption records, he'd been placed in foster care after his parents were involved in a serious car accident. But the records had always been vague about the details, and he'd been told his parents had died. "Mrs. Patterson," Marcus said, his voice barely steady, "what year did this happen?" 1993. March 15th, 1993. I remember because it was the Ides of March. Robert always said it was a cursed date after that. Marcus had to sit down. March 15th, 1993. That was the exact date on his foster care placement records. The date his old life had ended and his new one had begun. "What was your husband's full name?" Marcus asked, though he was almost afraid to hear the answer. "Robert James Patterson." "Why are you asking these questions?" Marcus stared at the elevator control panel, his mind reeling. Robert James Patterson. He'd never heard that name before, but something about it felt familiar in a way he couldn't explain. The coincidences were piling up: the date, the location, the age, the circumstances. "Mrs. Patterson," Marcus said slowly, "I need to ask you something, and I know it's going to sound strange. But did the doctors actually see your son's body after the accident?" There was a long silence from the intercom. When Mrs. Patterson finally spoke, her voice was shaky. "No," they said. "They said the injuries were too severe. That it would be better if we remembered him as he was. We had a closed casket funeral." Robert never got over not being able to say goodbye properly. Marcus's heart was pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears. "Mrs. Patterson, I was adopted when I was 3 years old. My birth name was Marcus Anderson, and I was placed in foster care after my parents were in a car accident on Highway 26 in March of 1993. The silence from the intercom stretched so long that Marcus began to wonder if the connection had failed. Then he heard a sound that made his blood run cold, the sound of someone trying very hard not to sob. "That's impossible," Mrs. Patterson whispered. "David died. They told us he died."
What?
Marcus looked down at his hands again, hands that Mrs. Patterson had just described as gentle despite their rough appearance. He thought about his instinctive skill with mechanical things, his ability to fix what was broken. He thought about the birthmark on his shoulder and the name Anderson and the date that had changed everything. "Mrs. Patterson," he said, his voice cracking, "I have a crescent-shaped birthmark on my left shoulder." The sound that came through the intercom was somewhere between a gasp and a cry. Marcus could hear her moving around in the elevator car, and when she spoke again, her voice was thick with tears. Oh my God, it can't be." "What? You said your name is Marcus?" "Yes, ma'am." "Marcus Thompson." "But my birth name was Marcus Anderson. We named him David Marcus," Mrs. Patterson said, her words coming in short, breathless bursts. "David Marcus Anderson Patterson."
Us?
Marcus was Robert's middle name. We were going to hyphenate the last name, but... Marcus felt tears running down his face as 32 years of questions suddenly began to arrange themselves into answers. The pieces were falling into place with a precision that seemed impossible, yet felt undeniably true. "Mrs. Patterson," he said, "I think I need to get you out of that elevator so we can talk face to face." "Yes," she said, her voice stronger now despite the tears. "Yes, please. I need to see you. I need to see your face." Marcus turned back to the control panel with renewed urgency. What had been a routine repair job had become the most important work of his life. Every wire he connected, every circuit he tested, was bringing him closer to a moment that would change everything as he worked. Mrs. Patterson continued talking, telling him details about the accident, about the confusion at the hospital, about the grief that had consumed her and her husband for over 3 decades. Marcus found himself remembering flashes of images that had always seemed like dreams, but might have been memories. A man with gentle hands teaching him to use tools. A woman singing lullabies in a voice that sounded familiar. Almost. There? Marcus called up to her as he made the final connections. Just a few more minutes. Marcus, Mrs. Patterson said, "What do you remember from before you were adopted?" Marcus paused, considering not much. "Sometimes I have dreams about a man who smelled like sawdust and motor oil. And there's this lullaby. I sometimes catch myself humming, but I don't know where I learned it." Mrs. Patterson began to sing very softly, a melody that Marcus had carried in his heart his entire life without knowing why. The elevator system came back online with a gentle hum. The elevator car lurched slightly as it began its descent. Mechanical hum filling the silence that had settled between Marcus and the woman who might be his mother. His hands trembled as he guided the car down, bypassing the automated systems to ensure a smooth landing. Each floor that passed felt like a countdown to a moment that would either shatter his world or rebuild it entirely. When the doors finally opened on the ground floor, Marcus found himself face to face with a woman in her early 70s. Eleanor Patterson had silver hair that caught the lobby's fluorescent lights, and her brown eyes that seemed to take in everything were red from crying. She stepped out of the elevator slowly, her gaze fixed on Marcus's face with an intensity that made him feel transparent. "Dear God," she whispered, her hand reaching toward his face before stopping short. "You have Robert's jawline? Those eyes. They're exactly like mine were at your age." Marcus stood frozen, his toolbox forgotten at his feet. Eleanor was shorter than he'd expected, probably 5'4", but she carried herself with a dignity that seemed to fill the space around her. She wore a simple blue dress that looked like it had been chosen quickly, and her hands that were surprisingly steady despite everything bore the wedding ring she'd worn for 53 years. "I don't know what to say," Marcus admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Eleanor's eyes traveled over his face, taking in every detail. "You're taller than I thought you'd be. Robert is 6'2", and I always wondered if David would inherit his height." She paused, then corrected herself. "If you would inherit his height." Janet Walsh, who had been watching this exchange with growing confusion, finally spoke up. "I'm sorry, but what exactly is happening here? Mrs. Patterson, do you know this man?" Eleanor turned to Janet, her composure remarkably intact despite the tears still glistening in her eyes. "Janet, I believe this young man might be my son. The son I thought died 32 years ago." Janet's coffee cup clattered to the floor. Marcus felt the world spinning around him. "We need to sit down. We need to talk about this properly." Eleanor nodded. "Yes, but first I need to call the hospital. Robert needs to know." "Is he well enough for news like this?" Marcus asked, concerned creeping into his voice. "He's dying," Eleanor said simply. "But if there's even a chance that you're David, that you're our son, he needs to know before it's too late." They moved to the lobby seating area, a collection of worn leather chairs that had seen better days. Eleanor pulled out an old flip phone, her fingers shaking slightly as she dialed. "Robert, it's me. I know it's late, but something incredible has happened." She paused, listening. "No, I'm fine. Got stuck in the elevator, but that's not why. I'm calling Robert the man who fixed the elevator, ... He might be David." Marcus could hear a faint voice on the other end of the line, growing more animated. "I know how it sounds, but Robert, he has the birthmark. He was adopted after a car accident on Highway 26 in March of 1993. His birth name was Marcus Anderson." Eleanor's voice grew stronger. "I think our son is alive." The conversation continued for several minutes, with Eleanor explaining the details of their encounter. Marcus watched her face, searching for resemblances, for anything that might confirm or deny the possibility that had turned his world upside down. When Eleanor finally hung up, she was smiling through her tears. "He wants to meet you. He's been awake all night anyway. The pain makes it hard to sleep. If you're willing, we could go to the hospital now." Marcus looked at his watch. It was nearly 4 a.m. "You sure he's up for this?" "It's Marcus," Eleanor said, and hearing her say his name sent a chill down his spine. "If you really are our son, then this might be the last chance Robert gets to see you. The doctors think he has days, maybe a week at most." The drive to Portland General Hospital was surreal. Marcus followed Eleanor's directions through the empty streets, his mind racing with questions and doubts. What if this was all a terrible coincidence? What if he was giving false hope to a dying man and his grieving wife? But the details were too specific, too aligned with his own fragmented memories at the hospital. Eleanor led him through corridors that smelled of disinfectant and floor wax. The ICU was quiet except for the constant beeping of monitors and the soft whisper of ventilators. Eleanor stopped outside room 314. "He's been asking about you for the past hour," she said softly. He made the nurses help him sit up in bed. He wanted to look presentable. Marcus took a deep breath and followed Eleanor into the room. Robert Patterson was a large man, even diminished by illness. His shoulders were broad beneath the hospital gown, and his hands, those gentle hands Eleanor had described, were folded across his chest. His hair was completely white now, thinning on top, but his eyes were alert and focused entirely on Marcus. "Hello, son," Robert said, his voice hoarse but steady. Marcus felt his knees nearly buckle. Something about Robert's voice, deeper than Eleanor's, but with the same careful cadence, triggered a memory so vivid it took his breath away. A man teaching him to hold a screwdriver, showing him how to turn screws, lefty-loosey, righty-tighty, in that same voice. "I remember you, Marcus," whispered, moving closer to the bed. "You taught me about tools." Robert's eyes filled with tears. "You always wanted to help me fix things. I mean, even when you were barely walking, you'd toddle over with your toy hammer whenever I was working on something." Eleanor pulled up a chair for Marcus beside the bed. As he sat down, Robert reached out and gently took his hand. "These are working hands," Robert said, examining Marcus's calloused fingers and scarred knuckles. "You became a fixer, just like we talked about when you were little." "I don't understand what happened," Marcus said. "How did I end up in foster care if you survived the accident?" Robert's face darkened. The hospital made a mistake, a terrible, unforgivable mistake. He looked at Eleanor, who nodded encouragingly. "When the paramedics brought us in, we were all in critical condition. You had severe head injuries, and they didn't think you'd make it through the night. I was in a coma for 2 weeks," Robert continued. "Eleanor was unconscious for 4 days. By the time we were coherent enough to ask about you, the hospital told us you had died from your injuries." "But I didn't die," Marcus said, trying to piece together the timeline. "No," Eleanor said, sitting on the edge of Robert's bed. "What we think happened is that you were transferred to another hospital for specialized care. But somehow the records got mixed up. The hospital we were at probably received word that a child from the accident had died, and they assumed it was you." Robert squeezed Marcus's hand. "You planned your funeral while you were probably lying in another hospital bed fighting for your life." Marcus felt overwhelmed by the scope of the tragedy. "But how did I end up being adopted? What happened to my memories?" "Head injuries in young children can cause memory loss," Robert explained. "And the trauma of the accident, combined with being separated from us, probably made it even worse. When you woke up, you might not have remembered who you were or who we were." "The social workers would have placed you in emergency foster care," Eleanor added. "And if you couldn't tell them who your parents were, and if the hospital had already told us you were dead, there would have been no way to connect you back to us." Marcus tried to imagine what it must have been like for a 3-year-old child, waking up in a strange place with no memory of his family. No understanding of why the people he loved weren't there. The Thompsons had been good to him, had given him a loving home, but they'd never been able to fill the void he'd always felt. "I've spent my whole life feeling like something was missing," Marcus said. "Like there was a piece of me that I couldn't find." "I felt the same way," Robert said. "Every year on your birthday, Eleanor would make a cake. Yes. We'd sit at the kitchen table and tell stories about you, about what you might have been like if you'd grown up with us." Eleanor wiped tears from her eyes. "I used to imagine you becoming a doctor or a teacher. I never imagined you'd become a man who fixes things, just like your father." "Tell me about him," Marcus said, looking at Robert. "Tell me about the man." "I don't remember being—" Robert smiled, and for a moment the pain seemed to leave his face. "You were curious about everything. You'd take apart your toys just to see how they worked. Eleanor would find you in the living room with a pile of plastic pieces, trying to put them back together. And you were so gentle with living things," Eleanor added. "We had a cat named Whiskers, and you'd spend hours just petting him, being so careful not to hurt him. You loved bedtime stories, Robert said, but not the usual ones. She wanted stories about how things worked. I'd make up tales about brave little screws who held bridges together, or tiny gears that made clocks tick. As they talked, Marcus found himself remembering more fragments. The smell of coffee and bacon on Sunday mornings. A woman's voice reading to him from a book with colorful pictures. A man's laugh that rumbled like distant thunder. "What about the adoption papers?" Marcus asked. "I said my parents died in the accident." "That's what everyone believed," Robert said. "The hospital's mistake became the official record. We were listed as deceased on your case files, and you were listed as deceased on ours. It was a bureaucratic nightmare that kept us apart for 32 years." Eleanor stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the city lights. "I used to drive by playgrounds and schools, wondering if you were out there somewhere. Part of me always hoped that the doctors had been wrong, that somehow you'd survived." "I did survive," Marcus said, "and I had a good life. The Thompsons were wonderful parents. They loved me, and they gave me everything I needed." "I'm glad," Robert said sincerely. "I'm glad you were loved. That's all any parent wants for their child." Marcus felt a wave of emotion wash over him. "But I missed out on 32 years with you. We all missed out." "We can't change the past," Eleanor said, returning to her chair. "But we have right now. We have this moment." Robert nodded. "Tell me about your life, son. Tell me about the man you became." Marcus spent the next hour sharing his story, told them about the Thompsons, about growing up in suburban Portland, about discovering his love for mechanical things in high school. He talked about his decision to become an elevator technician, about starting his own emergency repair service, about the satisfaction he found in solving complex problems. "I never married," he admitted. "I dated, but I never found anyone who felt like home. I always thought there was something wrong with me, like I was looking for something that didn't exist." "Maybe you were looking for us," Eleanor suggested. "Gently, I think. Maybe I was," Marcus said. "I always felt like I was supposed to be somewhere else, with someone else." Robert's breathing had become more labored as the morning wore on, but his eyes remained bright and focused on Marcus. "I want you to know that not a day went by that I didn't think about you. Not a single day. I dreamed about you," Marcus said. "I never knew that's what they were. But I dreamed about hands that smelled like motor oil, about a voice that told me stories. I dreamed about being safe." "You were safe," Robert said. "You were always safe with us." Eleanor checked her watch. "It's almost 6 a.m. You must be exhausted, Marcus." Marcus realized he was tired, but not in the way he'd expected. He felt emotionally drained, but also strangely energized. As if something inside him had been switched on after years of lying dormant. "I don't want to leave," he said. "I feel like I just found you, and I don't want to lose you again." "You won't lose us," Robert said firmly. "We're not going anywhere." "Well, I might be going somewhere soon, but Eleanor will be here. And now that we've found each other, we're going to make the most of whatever time we have." Eleanor pulled out a photo album she'd been carrying in her purse. "I brought this from home. I thought you might want to see pictures of yourself as a child." Marcus opened the album with trembling hands. The first page showed a toddler with dark hair and brown eyes, sitting in a high chair with food smeared. Across his face, the child was laughing, his eyes bright with joy. "That's you on your second birthday," Eleanor said. "You'd gotten into the chocolate cake before we could stop you." Marcus turned the page and saw more photos of little boy playing with blocks, riding a tricycle, helping a man who was clearly Robert work on a car in the driveway. In every picture, the child looked happy and loved. "This is the last picture we took," Eleanor said softly, pointing to a photo of Marcus sitting on Robert's shoulders, both of them wearing matching baseball caps. It was the morning before the accident. Marcus stared at the photo. The man in the picture was 32 years younger than Robert, lying in the hospital bed, but the resemblance was unmistakable. And the child on his shoulders, Marcus could see himself in that little boy's face. "I look like both of you," Marcus said, amazed. "You have Robert's build in my eyes," Eleanor said. "But your stubbornness is all your own." Robert chuckled weakly. "He gets that from both of us, I'm afraid." As the sun began to rise outside the hospital window, casting long shadows across the room, Marcus felt something he'd never experienced before, a sense of belonging that went deeper than adoption papers or foster care records. He was sitting with his parents, his biological parents, and for the first time in his life, he felt complete. "What happens now?" Marcus asked. "Now we get to know each other again," Eleanor said. "We have a lot of catching up to do. And I have a lot of stories to tell you," Robert added. 32 years worth of stories about the son I never stopped loving." Marcus squeezed Robert's hand. "I have stories too, about the man I became, partly because of you, even though I didn't know it." As the morning light grew stronger, filling the hospital room with warmth, Marcus realized that his life had been split into two parts before 6:47 a.m. on this ordinary Tuesday morning, and after. Before, he'd been Marcus Thompson, the adopted elevator repairman who'd always felt like something was missing. After, he was David Marcus Anderson Patterson, a son who had found his way home after 32 years of being lost. The story was far from over. But this chapter, the chapter where the missing piece finally fit into place, was just beginning. 3 days after the reunion, Marcus found himself doing something he'd never done before, taking time off work. His emergency service had been his life for 15 years, but suddenly there were more important things than broken elevators and malfunctioning machinery. He'd arranged for his colleague Danny Martinez to cover his calls while he spent every possible moment at Portland General Hospital. Robert's condition had stabilized. Somewhat since that first night, as if finding his son had given him a reason to fight a little longer, the doctors were cautiously optimistic that he might have weeks rather than days. Though they warned that his situation remained critical, Marcus arrived at the hospital each morning at 7 a.m., carrying coffee for Eleanor, and whatever breakfast he could find in the cafeteria. Eleanor had barely left Robert's side since that first night, sleeping in the uncomfortable reclining chair beside his bed, refusing to go home despite Marcus's gentle insistence that she needed rest. "I've missed 32 years with my son," she'd said firmly when he suggested she'd go home to sleep properly. "I'm not missing another minute if I can help it." On this particular morning, Marcus found Eleanor sitting in the hospital corridor outside Robert's room, talking quietly with a woman he didn't recognize. The stranger was tall and thin, probably in her late 50s, with auburn hair streaked, with gray and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, Alana said, standing as he approached. "I'd like you to meet Dr. Catherine Holloway. She's been Robert's oncologist for the past 2 years. Dr. Holloway extended her hand. "I've heard quite a lot about you, Marcus. Your parents are over the moon about finding you?" Marcus shook her hand, noting the way she said "your parents" as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "How is he today?" "That's what we were discussing," Dr. Holloway said. "Robert's improvement over the past few days has been remarkable. His vital signs are stronger, his pain levels have decreased, and his mental clarity is the best it's been in weeks." "Is that normal?" Marcus asked. Dr. Holloway smiled sadly. "There's nothing normal about terminal cancer, Marcus. But sometimes, when patients have something important to live for, something that gives them purpose, we see improvements that surprise everyone. The human spirit is more powerful than we give it credit for." Eleanor wiped tears from her eyes. "She thinks he might be strong enough to come home for a few days, just to be in familiar surroundings. Would that be safe?" Marcus asked, concern evident in his voice. "We'd set up hospice care," Dr. Holloway explained. "A hospital bed in your living room, round the clock, nursing support, all his medications managed. It wouldn't cure him, but it might give your family some precious time together in a more comfortable setting." Marcus looked at Eleanor, who was watching him with hopeful eyes. "What does Robert think about this?" "He wants to show you the workshop," Eleanor said with a small laugh. "He's been talking about it nonstop. He wants you to see where he built the cradle for your nursery, where he fixed all your broken toys." Marcus felt his chest tighten. An idea of seeing the space where his father had worked, where he'd created things with those gentle hands, was both thrilling and overwhelming. "Let's ask him," Marcus said. They found Robert awake and alert, propped up in bed with several pillows behind his back. His color was better than it had been since Marcus first met him, and his eyes had a brightness that hadn't been there before. "There's my boy Robert," said as Marcus entered the room. "Dr. Holloway says I might be able to break out of this place for a while," She says, "You want to show me your workshop?" Marcus said, pulling his chair closer to the bed. Robert's face lit up. "Wait until you see it. I kept every tool you ever played with as a child. I have your little plastic hammer, your toy screwdrivers. Eleanor kept telling me to throw them away, but I couldn't do it." "Robert," Eleanor said gently, "that was 32 years ago. Those things probably fell apart decades ago." "No, Robert," said firmly. "They're in the red toolbox on the second shelf. I check on them every few months." He turned to Marcus. "I know it sounds crazy, but keeping your things made me feel like you were still with us somehow." Marcus felt tears threatening. "It doesn't sound crazy at all." Dr. Holloway reviewed the discharge plans with them. If Robert's condition remained stable, he could go home the following day. The hospice team would arrive in the morning to set up equipment and brief Eleanor on his care routine. "There is one thing I need to discuss with all of you," Dr. Holloway said, her tone becoming more serious. "Robert's improvement is wonderful, but we need to be realistic about what this means. This is likely what we call a last surge, a phenomenon where terminal patients experience a period of increased energy and clarity before the final decline." Eleanor nodded. "We understand. We're grateful for whatever time we have." "How long?" Marcus asked quietly. "It's impossible to say exactly," Dr. Holloway replied. "Days, possibly a week or two. But Marcus, these might be the most important days of your father's life and yours." After Dr. Holloway left, Marcus spent the afternoon learning about his family's history. Eleanor had brought more photo albums and a box of documents she'd been saving for over 3 decades. "These are your birth certificates," she said, handing him a folder. "The original one and the amended one we got after the adoption proceedings were supposed to start." Marcus examined the documents. His original birth certificate listed his name as David Marcus Anderson Patterson, born on September 14, 1992, to Robert James Patterson and Eleanor Marie Anderson Patterson. The amended certificate, dated after the accident, listed him as deceased. "We never officially changed it back," Eleanor explained. "We didn't know how, and honestly we were too heartbroken to deal with the bureaucracy." "What about my social security number? My driver's license?" "You probably have 2 identities in the system," Eleanor said. "David Marcus Anderson Patterson, who officially died in 1993, and Marcus Thompson, who started existing around the same time." Marcus shook his head in amazement. "This is going to be complicated to sort out." "We'll figure it out together," Eleanor said. "The important thing is that we found each other." Robert had been listening to their conversation with his eyes closed, but Marcus could tell he wasn't sleeping. "Dad," Marcus said, the word feeling strange but right in his mouth. Robert opened his eyes and smiled. "I love hearing you call me that. Tell me about the workshop. What kind of things did you build there?" Robert's eyes grew distant. "Everything. I built your crib when Eleanor was pregnant. Made a toy chest shaped like a treasure box. After the accident, I threw myself into woodworking. It was the only thing that helped with the grief." "What did you make?" "Furniture, mostly. Tables, chairs, cabinets. Made a dining room set for the Kowalskis down the street when their son got married. Built a tree house for the Henderson kids next door." Robert paused. "But every piece I made, I pretended I was making it for you. I'd imagine you helping me measure the wood, handing me tools, learning how to sand properly." Eleanor pulled out another photo album. These are pictures of some of his projects over the years. Marcus flipped through pages of beautiful handcrafted furniture. Each piece showed incredible attention to detail and obvious pride in workmanship. There were dining tables with intricate inlays, rocking chairs with perfectly curved runners, and bookshelves that looked like they belonged in expensive homes. "You could have been a professional furniture maker," Marcus said, impressed. "I was, in a way," Robert replied. "After I retired from construction, I started taking commissions. It gave me something to do with my hands, something to focus on besides missing you." "I want to learn," Marcus said suddenly. "I want you to teach me woodworking." Robert's eyes filled with tears. "I'd like that more than anything." Eleanor stood up. "I'm going to call the hospice coordinator and make sure everything is ready for tomorrow. You to keep talking." After Eleanor left, Robert gestured for Marcus to come closer. "Son, There's something I need to tell you, and I need to tell you while we're alone. Marcus pulled his chair right next to the bed. What is it? I've been carrying guilt about that. Accident for 32 years, Robert said, his voice shaking. I was the one driving. I made the decision to go visit my mother that day. I hadn't insisted on that trip. You never would have been in that car. Dad, let me finish, Robert interrupted. When I thought you died, the guilt nearly killed me. Spent years in therapy, but I never fully forgave myself. Finding out that you're alive, that you grew up to be this incredible man, it's like a weight has been lifted off my soul. Marcus took Robert's hand. The accident wasn't your fault. You couldn't have known what would happen. I know that in my head, Robert said, but my heart has been broken for 32 years. Not just because I lost you, but because I thought I'd killed you. You didn't kill me, Marcus said firmly. You gave me life. And even though we were separated, some of you stayed with me. I became a man who fixes things, just like you. I have gentle hands, just like you. I found my way back to you, didn't I? Robert squeezed Marcus's hand. You did. My boy found his way home. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, just holding hands and watching the afternoon sun move across the hospital room. Marcus found himself memorizing details, the way Robert's breathing sounded, the warmth of his hand, the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled. Marcus, Robert said eventually, I want you to have the workshop. All the tools, all the equipment, everything. Dad, you might get better. You could have more time. Robert shook his head gently. Son, we both know what's happening here. Dr. Holloway was being kind, but I can feel my body giving up. I'm not afraid of dying not anymore. Dad, I want. But I want to know that the workshop will be used, that the tools will be in the hands of someone who understands their purpose. What? Marcus felt tears running down his cheeks. I don't know anything about woodworking. You will, Robert said confidently. You have the hands for it, and you have the patience. The rest is just practice. Eleanor returned with good news. The hospice team could have everything ready by the following morning, and Robert's discharge was approved. They would go home. Together, all three of them, for the first time in 32 years. That evening, Marcus went to his apartment to pack a bag. He looked around the small space he'd called home for the past 8 years, realizing how empty it had always felt. The walls were bare except for a few certificates from elevator companies and a single photo of him with his adoptive parents. There were no family pictures, no mementos from childhood, no signs of a life fully lived. He packed enough clothes for a week, though he suspected he might end up staying longer. As he was about to leave, he noticed the toolbox sitting in the corner of his bedroom, the same one he'd carried to Riverside Towers 3 nights ago. When this all began, Marcus picked up the toolbox and added it to his bags. His work tools would come with him to his father's house, where they would meet the tools that had shaped his earliest memories. It felt like the completion of a circle that had been broken decades ago. The drive to his parents' house he was still getting used to. Thinking of them that weighed him through neighborhoods he'd driven past hundreds of times without realizing their significance. Eleanor had given him the address, 847 Maple Street. A modest 2-story house in a tree-lined neighborhood that had probably been built in the 1960s when he pulled into the driveway. Marcus sat in his van for a moment, looking at the house where he'd spent the first 3 years of his life. The white exterior had been recently painted, and the front yard was meticulously maintained. There was a large oak tree in the front yard that looked like it had been there for decades, possibly. The same tree he'd played under as a child. Eleanor opened the front door before he could knock. "Welcome home, son," she said. And the words hit him with unexpected force. Home. After 32 years of searching for something he couldn't name, Marcus had finally found it. The hospice team had already transformed the living room into a comfortable medical facility. A hospital bed sat where the couch used to be, surrounded by monitoring equipment and medical supplies. But despite the clinical additions, the room felt warm and lived in. "Your father is resting," Eleanor said. "The transport from the hospital tired him out more than expected, but he's excited to show you the workshop tomorrow." Marcus looked around the living room, taking in the family photos that covered every surface. Most were of Robert and Eleanor at various stages of their marriage, but scattered throughout were the pictures of him as a child, the same ones Eleanor had shown him at the hospital, now in their original frames. You kept them out all these years? Marcus asked. Every single one, Eleanor said. People thought we were morbid, keeping pictures of a dead child on display. But Robert always said you weren't really gone as long as we remembered you. Marcus picked up a photo of himself at what looked like his 3rd birthday party. He was sitting at a small table with a cake shaped like a fire truck, his face covered in chocolate frosting, laughing at something out of frame. I remember this, he said suddenly. I remember the fire truck cake. Eleanor's face lit up. You do? Not clearly, but there's something familiar about it, like déjà vu, but stronger. That was your last birthday with us, Eleanor said softly. The accident happened 2 weeks later. Marcus set the photo down carefully. I'm sorry I missed so many birthdays. You're here now, Eleanor said, putting her arm around his shoulders. That's what matters. As they prepared for bed, Marcus would sleep in what had been his childhood bedroom, which Eleanor had preserved exactly as it was. He felt a sense of peace he'd never experienced. Tomorrow, he would see his father's workshop. Tomorrow, he would begin learning about the craft that had sustained Robert through 3 decades of grief. Tomorrow, he would start building the relationship with his parents that should have lasted his entire life. But tonight, for the first time since he was 3 years old, Marcus Anderson Patterson was sleeping in his family home, surrounded by people who had never stopped loving him. The missing piece had finally found its place. Marcus woke to the sound of quiet voices drifting from the living room below. Sunlight filtered through curtains that still bore traces of childhood faded. Dinosaur patterns that Eleanor had never had the heart to replace. He lay still for a moment, absorbing the strangeness of waking up in a room that was simultaneously foreign and deeply familiar. The hospice nurse, a gentlewoman named Patricia Vance, was checking Robert's vitals when Marcus came downstairs. She spoke in the soft, measured tones of someone accustomed to working with dying patients and grieving families. His oxygen levels are good this morning, Patricia was telling Eleanor. Blood pressure is stable. Pain seems manageable. Robert was awake and alert, propped up in the hospital bed with a steaming cup of coffee on the tray beside him. When he saw Marcus, his face brightened considerably. Good morning, son. Ready to see where the magic happens? Marcus poured himself coffee from the pot Eleanor had prepared. Are you sure you're up for this? We don't have to do it today. Marcus, Robert said with surprising firmness. I've been waiting 32 years to show you my workshop. I'm not waiting for another day. Patricia finished her examination and began packing her equipment. I'll be back this evening to check on you, Mr. Patterson. Remember what we discussed about overdoing it? Yes, ma'am, Robert replied, with a mischievous grin that reminded Marcus of the child in those old photographs. After Patricia left, Lenore helped Robert into his wheelchair, concession to his weakened state that he'd initially resisted. Marcus offered to push the chair, but Robert insisted on propelling himself through the house toward the back door. Independence was always important to your father, Eleanor explained as they made their way through the kitchen, even now. Workshop occupied a converted 2-car garage behind the house. As Robert wheeled himself up the ramp he'd built decades earlier, Marcus noticed the care that had gone into every detail of the space. The concrete floor was painted a clean gray, and fluorescent lights hung from the ceiling in perfectly straight lines. Tool pegboards covered 3 walls, each tool hanging in its designated spot, outlined in black markers so there was never any question about where things belonged. But it was the workbenches that took Marcus's breath away. There were 3 of them, each designed for specific types of work. The main bench, a massive oak construction that dominated the center of the space, bore the scars and stains of decades of use. A smaller, more delicate bench near the window was clearly designed for detail work. And against the far wall sat a 3rd bench that was obviously newer than the others, and exactly the right height for a small child. You built that for me? Marcus said, pointing to the child-sized workbench. The summer before the accident, Robert confirmed. You were getting frustrated trying to reach my big bench. I thought if you had your own workspace, you might be able to help me more effectively. Marcus walked over to the small bench and ran his hand along its surface. The wood was smooth and unmarked, as if it had been waiting all these years for small hands to begin their work. I used to sand it down every few years, Robert admitted, just to keep it ready. Eleanor wiped tears from her eyes. He'd come out here every weekend, maintaining tools and equipment for a child who never came home. The red toolbox sat exactly where Robert had said it would be, on the second shelf of a storage unit near the child's workbench. Marcus opened it with trembling hands and found the plastic tools of his childhood, a tiny hammer with a blue handle, miniature screwdrivers in red and yellow, a toy level that still had its bubble intact. "I can't believe you kept these," Marcus whispered. "They were all I had left of my boy," Robert said simply. "Some people keep baby clothes or blankets. I kept the tools that showed me who you were going to become." Marcus picked up the small plastic hammer and was instantly transported. The memory was vivid and complete, sitting on this exact bench, trying to pound a nail into a piece of scrap wood, while Robert guided his tiny hands. The smell of sawdust, the sound of Robert's patient voice explaining how to hold the hammer properly, the warmth of being included in important grown-up work. "I remember this," Marcus said, his voice thick with emotion. "I remember you teaching me to hammer. You were so proud when you finally got that nail to go straight," Robert said. "You ran into the house yelling for Eleanor to come see what you'd accomplished." Eleanor smiled through her tears. "You dragged me out here in my pajamas and slippers to admire one crooked nail on a piece of 2x4. "It wasn't crooked," Robert protested with mock indignation. "It had character." For the next several hours, Robert gave Marcus a comprehensive tour of the workshop. Every tool had a story. Every piece of equipment served a specific purpose. Marcus learned about different types of wood, about grain patterns and moisture content, about the subtle differences between various chisels and planes. "This is my pride and joy," Robert said, wheeling himself over to a cabinet that took up an entire corner of the workshop. Inside, perfectly organized in custom-fitted drawers, was a collection of hand tools that looked like they belonged in a museum. "Some of these belong to my father," Robert explained, carefully lifting out a wooden plane that gleamed with age and care. "This one's from the 1940s, still sharp as the day it was made." Marcus took the plane and marveled at its weight and balance. The wooden body was worn smooth by decades of use, and the metal blade gleamed like silver. "Feel how it sits in your hand," Robert instructed. "A good tool becomes an extension of yourself. You don't fight with it, you work with it." As Marcus experimented with the plane on a piece of practice wood, Robert explained the fundamentals of woodworking. Patience was paramount. Every cut had to be measured twice. Every joint had to be perfect. There were no shortcuts in quality craftsmanship. "Your hands remember more than you think," Robert observed as Marcus instinctively adjusted his grip on the plane. "Look how naturally you hold that tool." Eleanor had set up a folding chair in the workshop and spent the morning watching father and son reconnect through the language of craftsmanship. She'd brought her knitting, a habit she'd developed during Robert's cancer treatments, but the yarn sat untouched in her lap as she absorbed every moment of their interaction. "What was the first thing you built after the accident?" Marcus asked during a break. Robert's expression grew distant. "A memorial box. I made it to hold the few things we had from your funeral, the program, some flowers that Eleanor had pressed, a few cards from friends. It took me 3 months to finish because I kept stopping to cry. Where is it now? In our bedroom closet? I haven't opened it in 15 years. Marcus set down the chisel he'd been examining. "Maybe we should open it together." "Maybe we should," Robert agreed. "But first, let me show you something else." Robert wheeled himself to the far end of the workshop, where a large object sat covered by a canvas tarp. With Eleanor's help, he pulled away the covering to reveal a beautifully crafted rocking chair. "I finished this last month," Robert said. "It was supposed to be for the baby nursery at St. Mary's Hospital, part of their charity auction. But when Dr. Holloway told me I didn't have much time left, I decided to keep it." The rocking chair was a masterpiece of craftsmanship. It was a warm cherry that glowed in the workshop's lighting, and every joint was seamless. The curved rockers were perfectly balanced, and the seat was contoured for maximum comfort. "It's incredible," Marcus said, running his hand along the chair's arm. "How long did it take you to make?" "About 6 months," working a few hours each day. He kept thinking about all the babies who would be rocked to sleep in this chair, all the parents who would find comfort in its motion. Robert paused. Now I'm thinking it might be nice to have in our living room. For when you have children of your own. Marcus felt his throat tighten. The idea of having children, of carrying on the family line that had seemed so broken, was something he'd barely allowed himself to consider. I'd like that, he managed to say. As the afternoon wore on, Robert grew visibly tired, but he refused to go back inside. Instead, he had Marcus help him transfer from the wheelchair to a comfortable chair they brought from the house. Let's start you on a real project, Robert said. Something simple, but something you can finish and keep. He corrected Marcus too. Select a piece of pine from the lumber rack, a clear board about 8 inches wide and 3 feet long. Under Robert's guidance, Marcus learned to use the table saw, carefully cutting the board into smaller pieces. What are we making? Marcus asked. A box, Robert replied. Every woodworker's first serious project should be a box. Teaches you about joinery, about precision, about finishing. Plus, everyone needs a place to keep important things. The work was meticulous and challenging. Robert insisted that every measurement be exact, every cut be perfect. When Marcus's first attempt at a joint was slightly off, Robert had him cut a new piece rather than trying to make the joint work. Quality is non-negotiable, Robert explained. You can't hide bad craftsmanship under pretty stain or fancy hardware. The foundation has to be solid. As Marcus worked, muscle memory seemed to guide his hands. The tools felt familiar in ways he couldn't explain, and he found himself anticipating Robert's instructions before they were given. You're a natural, Robert observed. I always knew you would be. By late afternoon, Marcus had completed the basic structure of a small wooden box. The joints were tight, the corners were square, and the lid fit perfectly. It wasn't finished. It still needed sanding and staining, but it was unmistakably a piece of quality craftsmanship. I can't believe I made this, Marcus said, examining his work from every angle. You did more than make it, Robert said proudly. You crafted it. There's a difference. Eleanor appeared in the workshop doorway, carrying a tray with sandwiches and iced tea. Patricia called. She's running a bit late, so she'll be here around 7 instead of 6. They ate their impromptu workshop picnic. Robert shared stories about the various projects he'd completed over the years. The dining table he'd built for their 25th wedding anniversary. The hope chest he'd crafted for his niece's wedding. The countless repairs he'd done for neighbors who knew he couldn't say no to someone in need. After you disappeared from our lives, Robert said, I threw myself into helping other people. Every project was a way to honor your memory, to keep building things that would outlast me. You built a legacy, Marcus said. Even without knowing it, you were teaching me through all these years. My mechanical skills, my attention to detail, my instinct for fixing things, they all came from you. And now you're here to carry it forward, Robert replied. That's all any parent can hope for, that something of themselves will continue after they're gone. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows through the workshop windows, Robert made an announcement that surprised both Marcus and Eleanor. I want to transfer the deed to the house into Marcus's name, he said. This place should stay in the family. Eleanor nodded in agreement. We discussed it this morning while you were still sleeping. The house, the workshop, everything should be yours. Marcus felt overwhelmed. I can't accept something that valuable. You barely know who I am as an adult, son Robert said firmly. I know exactly who you are. You're the man who answered an emergency call at 2 a.m. and stayed to help a stranger. You're the man who spent the past 4 days sitting by my bedside instead of going back to your regular life. You're the man who fixed what was broken and brought our family back together. Eleanor stood up and kissed Marcus on the forehead. You're our son. This is your inheritance, and we want you to have it while we can see you enjoy it. As they prepared to head back to the house, Marcus took one last look around the workshop. Tomorrow he will return to the sand and finish his box. Next week, Robert Welling, they would start on a more complex project for years to come. The space would be where Marcus learned to carry on traditions that had been interrupted but never truly broken. Patricia arrived promptly at 7. As promised, after checking Robert's condition and administering his evening medications, She pulled Eleanor aside for a quiet conversation near the kitchen window. Marcus helped Robert prepare for bed, a process that involved adjusting multiple pillows and ensuring that all his medications were within easy reach. As he tucked the blanket around his father's shoulders, Robert caught his hand. "Thank you for today," Robert said. "It was the best day I've had in months." "Thank you for sharing it with me," Marcus replied. "For sharing everything with me.
Tomorrow.
We'll work on finishing your box. I want to show you the photo albums from my father's workshop. Come from a long line of men who build things, Marcus. It's in your blood." As Marcus climbed the stairs to his childhood bedroom, he carried with him the scent of sawdust and the satisfaction of work well done. His hands bore new calluses from the day's labor. His mind buzzed with techniques and tips that Robert had shared. For the first time in his adult life, Marcus felt connected to something larger than himself. The tradition of craftsmanship that stretched back generations and would, God willing, continue long after he was gone. In the workshop below, the unfinished box sat on the child-sized workbench, waiting for its creator to return and complete what he had begun. It was a simple project, but it represented something profound, the rekindling of a relationship between father and son, the restoration of a family that had been shattered by tragedy and misunderstanding. Marcus fell asleep that night with wood, shavings still clinging to his clothes and the echo of his father's proud voice saying, "You're a natural." After 32 years of wondering where he belonged, he finally had his answer. 1 week after coming home from the hospital, Robert experienced what Dr. Holloway had gently warned them about the beginning of the end. Marcus woke to find Eleanor sitting beside Robert's bed at 5:30 a.m., holding his hand while he struggled with breathing that had become increasingly labored during the night. "He's been asking for you," Eleanor whispered as Marcus approached. "He's been drifting in and out, but every time he wakes up, he asks if you're here." Robert's eyes fluttered open as if he'd sensed Marcus's presence. His face was pale, and the effort of breathing was clearly exhausting him, but when he saw his son, he managed a weak smile. "There's my boy," Robert whispered, his voice barely audible. "We need to finish your box today." Marcus knelt beside the bed, taking his father's other hand. Robert's grip was weaker than it had been even yesterday, and his skin felt paper-thin and cold. "Dad, we don't have to worry about the box right now. Just rest." "No," Robert said with surprising firmness. "A man finishes what he starts. That's the first rule of craftsmanship." Patricia arrived earlier than usual, having been called by Eleanor during the night. After a thorough examination, she pulled Eleanor and Marcus aside for a conversation. They'd all been dreading. "His breathing is becoming more compromised," Patricia explained gently. "The cancer has progressed to his lungs more rapidly than we expected. I'd estimate we're looking at days now, possibly hours." Eleanor's composure, which had held strong for over a week, finally cracked. Marcus put his arm around her shoulders as she sobbed quietly. "What can we do?" Marcus asked. "Keep him comfortable. Talk to him. Hearing is often the last sense to fade. If there are things that need to be said, say them now." Despite his condition, Robert insisted on being wheeled out to the workshop. It took both Marcus and Eleanor to help him from the bed to the wheelchair, and the short journey to the garage left him breathless and exhausted. But his eyes brightened when he saw the unfinished box sitting on the workbench where Marcus had left it. "Hand me the sandpaper," Robert instructed, his voice barely above a whisper. "The 220 grit. Need to smooth out those edges." For the next 2 hours, father and son worked side by side on the small wooden box. Robert's hands shook as he guided the sandpaper, but his attention to detail never wavered. He insisted that every surface be perfectly smooth, every corner precisely shaped. "Feel here," Robert said, guiding Marcus's fingers along the box's edge. "You can feel the difference between 120 grit and 220 grit. Always finish with the finest sandpaper you have." Marcus marveled at his father's dedication to perfection, even as his body was clearly failing. Every few minutes, Robert had to stop to catch his breath, but he refused to quit until the sanding was complete. "Now the stain," Robert said. "Cherry? Stains will bring out the grain in this pine, make it look like expensive wood." Under Robert's guidance, Marcus applied the stain with careful, even strokes. The transformation was remarkable. The simple pine board became something that looked rich and valuable. Beautiful, Robert said, admiring their work. You have good hands, son? Patient hands? As they waited for the stain to dry, Robert asked Eleanor to bring him something from the house. She returned with a small wooden box that Marcus recognized as the memorial box Robert had mentioned, the one containing mementos from Marcus's supposed funeral. I think it's time we put this to rest, Robert said. Opening the box with trembling fingers, inside were items that broke Marcus's heart, a small funeral program with his childhood photo on the cover, pressed flowers that had long since turned brown, sympathy cards from friends and family. At the bottom was a small envelope marked for David in Robert's handwriting. I wrote you a letter, Robert explained, the night before your funeral. I had so many things I wanted to say to you, things I thought I'd never get the chance to. Say, Robert's hands shook as he opened the envelope and unfolded a piece of paper that had been carefully preserved for 32 years. His voice was weak, but he began to read, My dearest David, tomorrow we will say goodbye to you, but I want you to know that you will never really be gone from our hearts. In your 3 short years, you taught me what it means to be a father. You showed me that love doesn't have conditions, that joy can be found in the smallest moments, and that the most important work a man can do is building a life with the people he loves. Robert paused to catch his breath, tears streaming down his face. Marcus and Eleanor were both crying now, but Robert continued, I promise that every day for the rest of my life, I will try to be the man you believed I was when you looked at me with those trusting brown eyes. I will build things that last. Help people who need help, and love your mother with the same fierce devotion I felt for you. And someday, when my time comes, I hope I will see you again and hear you call me Daddy one more time. Robert folded the letter carefully and handed it to Marcus. I don't need this anymore. I got to hear you call me Dad again. Marcus read the letter again, understanding for the first time the depth of grief his parents had carried for 3 decades. The guilt Robert had felt, the love that had never diminished, the hope that had somehow sustained them through the darkest period of their lives. I wish I could take away all those years of pain, Marcus said. You did, Robert replied. The moment you walked into that hospital room, you erased 32 years of grief. You gave us back our son. As the day progressed, Robert's condition deteriorated noticeably. By afternoon, he needed oxygen assistance, and his periods of consciousness became shorter and more sporadic. But every time he woke up, he asked about the box. Is it ready? He would whisper. Almost, Dad. Just waiting for the final coat to dry. That evening, as the sun set through the workshop windows, Marcus applied the final coat of protective finish to the wooden box. The piece gleamed under the fluorescent lights, transformed from a simple pine board into something beautiful and permanent. Perfect, Robert said, his voice barely audible. Now it's finished. Marcus held up the completed box, admiring their work together. It was small but elegant, with perfect joints and a flawless finish. More importantly, it was something they had created together, a tangible symbol of the relationship they'd rebuilt in just 1 week. What should I keep in it? Marcus asked. Robert smiled. Important things. Things that matter. Things you want to remember. As they prepared to go back into the house, Robert asked for one more favor. Help me write something for you, something you can keep. Eleanor brought paper and a pen, and Robert dictated while Marcus wrote, To my son Marcus, who found his way home after 32 years. This workshop is yours now, along with everything in it. Use these tools to build a life, to help people, to create things that will outlast us all. Remember that every project you complete carries forward a tradition that began long before. You were born and will continue long after you're gone. Work with your hands, but build with your heart. Love, Dad. Robert signed the letter with a shaking hand, then asked Marcus to place it in the wooden box they had just finished. Your first project, Robert said. Safe. That night, Robert's breathing became increasingly difficult. Dr. Holloway arrived around midnight, not for a regular check, but because Patricia had called her with concerns about Robert's rapid decline. After examining him, Dr. Holloway confirmed what they all knew was coming. It's time to gather anyone who needs to say goodbye, she said gently. Eleanor called Robert's brother Thomas, lived 2 hours away in Salem. She also called there. Longtime neighbors, the Hendersons, and Father Michael from St. Catherine's Church, where Robert and Eleanor had been members for 40 years. As these important people in Robert's life arrived throughout the night, Marcus found himself in the unique position of meeting his father's closest friends and family members for the first time, while simultaneously preparing to lose him forever. Thomas Patterson was a younger, healthier version of Robert, and the family resemblance was immediately apparent. When Eleanor introduced Marcus as their son David, Thomas's reaction was a mixture of shock, joy, and grief. "My God," Thomas said, embracing Marcus tightly. "You look just like Bobby did at your age. I can't believe you're really here." "I wish we'd found each other sooner," Marcus said. "So do I, nephew." "So do I." The Hendersons, Bill and Margaret, were the elderly couple who lived next door. They had known Marcus as a toddler and had grieved his supposed death alongside Robert and Eleanor. "You used to climb through the fence between our yards," Margaret told Marcus, tears streaming down her face. "You'd come over to help Bill in his garden, just like you helped your father with his projects." Father Michael, a man in his 70s, with kind eyes and gentle hands, had counseled Robert and Eleanor through the darkest period of their grief. He spent time alone with Robert, providing last rites and spiritual comfort as dawn approached. Robert's breathing became more labored. The oxygen machine worked constantly now, and his periods of consciousness were brief and far between. But he seemed aware that people were there, that he was surrounded by love. Around 7 a.m., Robert opened his eyes and looked directly at Marcus.
Oh.
With tremendous effort, he whispered, "Thank you for coming home. Thank you for waiting for me," Marcus replied, holding his father's hand. Robert smiled a peaceful, contented expression that seemed to encompass a lifetime of love and loss and redemption. Then he closed his eyes, and with Eleanor holding one hand and Marcus holding the other, Robert James Patterson slipped quietly away. The silence that followed was profound. No more struggling breaths, no more beeping monitors, just peace. Eleanor leaned forward and kissed Robert's forehead, whispering words of love and gratitude for a life well lived and a love that had endured beyond death itself. Marcus remained holding his father's hand for a long time, absorbing the weight of the moment. He had known Robert for only 9 days, but in that brief time, they had rebuilt a relationship that would influence the rest of Marcus's life. Dr. Holloway and Patricia handled the medical necessities with quiet professionalism. The hospice team had prepared the family for this moment. But nothing could truly prepare someone for the finality of death. As the morning progressed and the formalities were completed, Marcus found himself drawn back to the workshop. The wooden box sat on the workbench where they had left it, now containing Robert's final letter. Marcus picked up the box and held it carefully. Feeling the smooth finish they had applied together just hours before, Eleanor found him there, standing quietly among the tools and projects that had been Robert's passion for so many years. "He was proud of you," she said, putting her arm around Marcus's shoulders. "In 9 days, you gave him something he'd lost 32 years ago, a chance to be a father again." Marcus opened the wooden box and reread Robert's letter. The words felt like a compass, pointing him toward a future that honored both the father he'd barely known and the man who had raised him. "What happens now?" Marcus asked. "We celebrate his life," Eleanor said. "We tell stories about the man he was, we remember the love he shared, and we carry forward the things he taught us." Marcus looked around the workshop, his workshop. Noand made a silent promise to his father. He would learn every technique, master every tool, and use his hands to build things that mattered. He would honor the tradition Robert had preserved for him and pass it on to future generations. The wooden box would be the first of many projects, but it would always be the most important, a symbol of a love that had survived separation, grief, and even death itself. As Marcus and Eleanor walked back to the house together, the morning sun illuminated the workshop behind them, ready and waiting for the next generation of craftsmen to continue the work that Robert had begun. 3 months after Robert's funeral, Marcus stood in his father's workshop. Now, his workshop staring at a piece of oak that had been waiting for the right project. The familiar scent of sawdust and wood stain had become a comfort, and the tools that had once seemed foreign now felt like extensions of his hands. Eleanor had moved into the guest bedroom permanently. Unable to sleep in the master bedroom she'd shared with Robert for over 50 years. The arrangement worked well for both of them. She provided wisdom and company, while Marcus handled the physical demands of maintaining the old house. The transition hadn't been without challenges. Marcus had formally closed his elevator repair business, referring his regular clients to Danny Martinez, who had eagerly expanded his own operation. The decision had been easier than expected. Every emergency call had reminded him of that fateful night at Riverside Towers, and he found himself more drawn to the patient, methodical work of woodcrafting. "What are you thinking about making?" Eleanor asked, entering the workshop with 2 steaming mugs of coffee. It had become their morning ritual coffee in the workshop while Marcus planned his day's projects. "A dining table," Marcus replied, accepting the mug gratefully. "That couple from Beaverton called again yesterday? They're willing to wait 6 months if necessary." Eleanor smiled. Robert always said the best customers were the ones willing to wait for quality. Marcus had been surprised by how quickly word had spread about his woodworking. What started as a hobby to honor his father's memory had evolved into something more. Friends of Robert's began requesting simple projects. A jewelry box here, a bookshelf there. Each piece Marcus completed seemed to generate 2 more requests. "Been thinking about something," Eleanor said, settling into the comfortable chair they'd moved into the workshop for her daily visits. Robert always dreamed of expanding this place, maybe teaching classes to young people. He had plans drawn up before he got sick. Marcus paused in his examination of the oak board. "What kind of plans?" Eleanor disappeared into the house and returned with a folder Marcus had never seen. Inside were detailed blueprints for converting the basement into a classroom space, complete with multiple workbenches and storage for student projects. He wanted to call it Patterson's Workshop, Eleanor explained. A place where kids could learn traditional craftsmanship, maybe develop skills that would serve them their whole lives. Marcus studied the blueprints with growing excitement. Robert had thought of everything: proper ventilation, natural lighting, through new windows, even a small office space for record keeping and consultations. When did he draw these up? About 2 years ago, when he first got diagnosed? I think he knew his time was limited, and he wanted to ensure his knowledge wouldn't die with him. Marcus felt a familiar tightness in his chest, the bittersweet recognition of his father's foresight and generosity. Even facing his own mortality, Robert had been thinking about how to help others. "It would be expensive to build," Marcus said, though his mind was already working through the logistics. Robert had a life insurance policy, Eleanor revealed. Substantial one. Been wondering what to do with it, and I think this might be exactly what he would have wanted. That afternoon, Marcus drove to City Hall to research the permits and regulations required for operating a workshop school from a residential property. The bureaucratic maze was frustrating but not insurmountable. With proper zoning variances and safety certifications, Robert's dream could become reality. His next stop was Lincoln High School, where he'd arranged to meet with Janet Rodriguez, the industrial arts teacher. Janet was a woman in her 40s who'd been fighting budget cuts that threatened her program for years. "We're losing kids to video games and social media," Janet explained as she showed Marcus around the schools. "Outdated workshop. They don't understand the satisfaction of building something with their hands." Marcus examined the school's equipment, much of it dating from the 1980s and in desperate need of replacement or repair. What if there was an alternative? Marcus asked. A place where students could learn advanced techniques with professional grade tools. Janet's eyes lit up. "Are you talking about some kind of partnership program?" "I'm talking about bringing back apprenticeships," Marcus said. "Real training that leads to real skills and real jobs." They spent 2 hours discussing possibilities. Marcus could offer after-school and weekend programs, summer intensives, even adult education classes. Janet could provide curriculum guidance and help recruit students who showed aptitude for hands-on work. On his drive home, Marcus's phone rang. The caller ID showed a number he didn't recognize, with a Seattle area code. "Is this Marcus Thompson?" the voice asked when he answered. "Yes, though I go by Marcus Patterson now." "Mr. Patterson, this is Detective Lisa Chen with the Seattle Police Department. I'm calling about a case that might involve you, specifically about events from 1993. Marcus pulled over to the side of the road, his heart racing. What kind of case? We're investigating discrepancies in hospital records from the early 1990s. Your name came up in connection with a car accident victim who was incorrectly reported as deceased. We believe there may have been systemic issues with record keeping that affected multiple families. Marcus spent the next 20 minutes explaining his story to Detective Chen. She listened carefully, asking detailed questions about dates, locations, and the sequence of events that had separated him from his parents. Mr. Patterson, I think you may be the key to solving a much larger problem, Detective Chen said. We've identified at least 12 other cases where children were incorrectly listed as deceased following accidents or medical emergencies. Some of these kids may still be alive, living under different identities. The weight of this revelation hit Marcus hard. 12 other families might be living with the same grief his parents had carried for 32 years. 12 other children might be searching for answers about their origins. What do you need from me? Marcus asked. Would you be willing to testify about your experience? We're building a case against the private medical records company that handled data entry for several hospitals during that period. Their negligence destroyed families. Marcus didn't hesitate. Whatever you need. When he arrived home, Eleanor was in the kitchen preparing dinner. She took one look at his face and knew something significant had happened. What's wrong? She asked immediately. Marcus told her about Detective Chen's call and the investigation into systemic record-keeping failures.
Eleanor
sat down heavily, absorbing the implications. 12 other families, she said quietly. 12 other parents who went through what we went through, and 12 other children who grew up not knowing who they really were, Marcus added. Eleanor was quiet for a long time, processing this information. Finally, she spoke. Robert would want us to help them. Over dinner, they discussed the legal implications and emotional complexities of the case. Detective Chen had explained that the statute of limitations had expired for criminal charges. But civil lawsuits were still possible. More importantly, the investigation might reunite other separated families. I keep thinking about those parents, Eleanor said. Somewhere out there might be mothers and fathers who buried empty coffins, just like we did. Marcus had been thinking the same thing. The idea that other families were living with unnecessary grief while their children were alive and searching for answers was heartbreaking. The next morning brought a phone call that changed everything again. A woman named Sarah Mitchell from Phoenix, Arizona, had seen a news article about the Seattle investigation that mentioned Marcus's case. I think I might be one of the 12, Sarah said, her voice shaking. I was in a car accident in Portland in 1994. I was 4 years old. My adoptive parents told me my biological family died in the crash, but I've always had questions about the details. Marcus spent an hour on the phone with Sarah, comparing their stories. The similarities were striking. The same hospital system, the same medical records company, even the same social worker who had handled their placements. I've been searching for answers my whole life, Sarah said. I even hired a private investigator, but all the records led to dead ends. What was your birth name? Marcus asked. Jennifer Louise Campbell. The investigator found discrepancies in the death certificate, little things that didn't add up. After the call, Marcus contacted Detective Chen and shared Sarah's information. Within hours, Chen called back with news that sent chills down Marcus's spine. We found her family, Chen said. Jennifer Campbell's parents are alive and living in Spokane, Washington. They've been looking for her for 29 years. Reunion between Sarah and her parents was arranged for the following weekend. Marcus and Eleanor drove to Spokane to witness it, understanding better than anyone what the Campbell family was about to experience. Watching Sarah run into her mother's arms in the parking lot of a Spokane hotel, Marcus felt a profound sense of completion. His own story had been tragic, but ultimately redemptive. Now, because of his willingness to come forward, other families were finding their way back to each other. This is what Robert would have wanted, Eleanor whispered, tears streaming down her face as they watched the Campbell family hold each other for the first time in nearly 3 decades. Over the next several weeks, investigation gained national attention. Marcus found himself at the center of a media storm, appearing on news programs and talk shows to share his story. More importantly, Each appearance generated tips from other families who suspected they might be affected. The Patterson workshop project took on new urgency. Marcus realized that building something positive from tragedy was more than just honoring his father's memory. It was creating hope for the future. Construction began on the basement classroom in November. Marcus hired local contractors for the major work but insisted on doing the finished carpentry himself. Every piece of trim, every custom workbench, every storage cabinet was crafted by his own hands using techniques Robert had taught him. Eleanor documented the construction process with hundreds of photographs, creating a visual record of the workshop's transformation. She also began collecting stories from the families being reunited through the investigation, planning to compile them into a book that would honor all the lost children who were finding their way home. The first class was scheduled for January. With 12 students ranging in age from 14 to 67, Marcus had developed a curriculum that combined traditional techniques with modern safety practices, creating a learning environment that would have made Robert proud. On Christmas Eve, exactly 1 year after that life-changing elevator repair call, Marcus stood in the completed workshop classroom. The space buzzed with potential 24 workbenches arranged in perfect rows, tool pegboards stocked with quality equipment, and large windows flooding the room with natural light. Eleanor joined him, carrying the wooden box they had completed. Together, the box that now contained not just Robert's final letter, but newspaper clippings about the investigation, photos from reunited families, and plans for the workshop's expansion. He'd be so proud, Eleanor said, surveying the classroom that would soon be filled with students, eager to learn the satisfaction of creating something lasting with their hands. I think he knew, Marcus replied. Somehow I think he knew that. Finding me would lead to all of this. As they prepared to leave the workshop, Marcus noticed something that made him smile. On the pegboard near the instructor's station, someone had hung the small plastic hammer from his childhood toolbox. Same red and blue toy he'd played with 32 years earlier. It was Eleanor's touch, he realized. A reminder that even the smallest tools can build something important, and that even the most broken things can be repaired with patience, love, and the willingness to never give up hope. The Patterson Workshop would open its doors to students. In just 2 weeks, ready to teach a new generation that the most important things in life aren't bought, they're built. One careful project at a time. With hands that remember the touch of those who came before, and hearts that look forward to those who will come after. 2 years after opening the Patterson Workshop, Marcus received a letter that would fundamentally change his understanding of his father's impact on the world. The envelope bore the return address of Brennan and Associates, attorneys at law from Chicago, Illinois. Inside was a formal notice that Robert James Patterson had been named as a beneficiary in the will of a man named Arthur Brennan, who had passed away the previous month at the age of 93. The letter requested Marcus's presence at the reading of the will as Robert's heir. I've never heard Dad mention anyone named Arthur Brennan, Eleanor said when Marcus showed her the letter. They were sitting in the workshop office, a cozy space. Marcus had added above the classroom where he handled the administrative side of the growing program. The name doesn't ring any bells for me either, Marcus replied, studying the lawyer's letterhead. But the letter says Mr. Brennan specifically requested that Robert's family be contacted if Robert predeceased him. Eleanor pulled out her address book, a thick, well-worn volume that contained decades of Robert's business contacts and friendships. Brennan, she murmured, flipping through pages. Her Arthur, Brennan, Chicago. Robert has a note. That says Vietnam, 1971 to 72. Marcus felt a chill of recognition. Robert had rarely spoken about his military service, and when he did, was usually in vague terms about doing his duty and learning responsibility. Eleanor had once mentioned that Robert's experience in Vietnam had shaped his desire to build rather than destroy. She'd never shared details. The flight to Chicago was Marcus's first time leaving Oregon since the investigation into separated families had concluded. Eleanor had chosen to stay home, saying that Robert's wartime experiences were something Marcus should explore on his own. Some stories belong to the men who lived them, she'd said. If Robert wanted me to know everything about his time in the war, he would have shared it. Brennan and Associates occupied the top 3 floors of a downtown Chicago Harrah's. The law firm's offices were elegantly appointed with dark wood paneling and expensive artwork, suggesting a practice that served wealthy clientele. James Brennan, Jr., Arthur's son and the firm's managing partner, greeted Marcus in a conference room that overlooked Lake Michigan. He was a man in his 60s with silver hair and kind eyes that reminded Marcus of his father. "Mr. Patterson, thank you for coming," James said, shaking Marcus's hand warmly. "My father spoke of Robert often. Over the years. I feel like I know your father, even though we never met." "How did your father know my dad?" Marcus asked. James opened a thick file folder. They served together in Vietnam. "My father always said that Robert Patterson saved his life, though he was never specific about the circumstances." What followed was a story that Marcus had never heard, about a 22-year-old Robert Patterson who volunteered for one of the most dangerous jobs in the war tunnel rat operations. These were the soldiers who crawled through the underground tunnel systems used by enemy forces, clearing them of booby traps and gathering intelligence. "Your father and mine were partnered for these missions," James explained. Robert was the primary tunnel rat because of his mechanical skills. He could identify and disarm explosive devices that would have killed less experienced soldiers. Marcus learned that during one mission in December 1971, Robert had discovered that a tunnel system was rigged with a massive explosive device designed to collapse an entire section of an American base camp. While defusing the device, Robert had been trapped by a cave-in with Arthur Brennan as his only backup. "My father never went into detail about what happened next," James continued. "But I know that Robert talked him through the defusing process. From inside the collapsed tunnel, my father, following Robert's instructions, was able to complete the disarmament and then dig Robert out. The explosion, if it had detonated, would have killed over 200 American soldiers. Robert's actions that day had earned him a Bronze Star for valor, though he'd never mentioned the medal to his family. My father spent the rest of his life trying to repay that debt," James said. "He went to law school on the GI Bill, built this firm, and became quite wealthy. But he never forgot the man who saved his life, and the lives of so many others." Arthur Brennan's will revealed the extent of his gratitude. It left Marcus and Eleanor the sum of $2 million, along with a collection of letters he'd written to Robert over the years, letters that Robert had apparently never received. "My father tried to stay in touch," James explained, "but Robert seemed to disappear after the war. My father hired investigators, but they could never locate him." Marcus understood why. Robert had returned from Vietnam changed by what he'd experienced. He'd moved from his hometown in Ohio to Portland, Oregon, seeking a fresh start far from the memories of war. He'd focused on building rather than destroying, on creating life rather than taking it, the letters. Arthur had painted a picture of a man, haunted by survivor's guilt, who'd spent decades trying to find the soldier who'd saved him. The most recent letter, dated just months before Arthur's death, contained a revelation that stunned Marcus. "I never married, never had children of my own," Arthur had written. "I always felt that my life belonged to Robert Patterson, since he gave it back to me in that tunnel. I've spent 50 years building wealth that has no meaning without family to share it. If anything happens to me, I want Robert's family to know that every success I achieved was built on the foundation of his courage." James handed Marcus a manila envelope marked "Personal effects for Robert Patterson's family." Inside were photographs from Vietnam showing 2 young soldiers, who looked impossibly young for the dangerous work they were doing. Robert, barely recognizable under his military gear, had the same gentle eyes that Marcus remembered from their brief time together, but it was the final item in the envelope that brought tears to Marcus's eyes, a small wooden cross that Robert had carved and given to Arthur during their service. The workmanship was crude compared to Robert's later projects, but the love and care were evident in every detail. "My father carried this cross every day for 50 years, James said. He wanted it returned to Robert's family, flying back to Portland. Marcus felt the weight of his father's hidden heroism. Robert had saved hundreds of lives during the war, then spent the rest of his life quietly building things and helping people. never seeking recognition or reward. Eleanor wept when Marcus shared Arthur's story and showed her the photographs. "He never told me about any of this," she said, holding the wooden cross. "He just said he'd done his job and come home." "That's exactly what Dad would say," Marcus replied. "He never needed the world to know what he'd done, just needed to know he'd made a difference." The $2 million from Arthur's estate presented Marcus and Eleanor with an opportunity to expand Robert's legacy in ways they'd never imagined. After much discussion, they decided to establish the Patterson-Brennan Foundation, dedicated to teaching traditional craftsmanship, skills to at-risk youth and veterans. The foundation's first major project was the construction of a full-scale vocational training center adjacent to the original Patterson workshop. The new facility would offer comprehensive programs in woodworking, metalworking, electrical trades, and construction skills. "We'll call it the Arthur Brennan Memorial Center," Marcus announced to Eleanor as they reviewed architectural plans. Dad would want his friend's generosity to be remembered. Construction began that spring, with Marcus once again insisting on doing much of the finish work himself. The project became a community effort, with graduates of the original Patterson workshop volunteering their time and newly acquired skills. Sarah Mitchell, Phoenix woman who'd been reunited with her family through Marcus's case, moved to Portland, specifically to help with the foundation's work. She brought expertise in social work and counseling that proved invaluable in developing programs for troubled youth. "You gave me back my family," Sarah told Marcus during one of their planning meetings. "Now I want to help give other people hope and direction." The Memorial Center opened 18 months later with a ceremony attended by over 300 people, including veterans groups from across the Pacific Northwest and families who'd been reunited through the ongoing investigation into separated children. James Brennan Jr. flew in from Chicago for the dedication, bringing with him a surprise that moved everyone. Present a letter from the President of the United States acknowledging Robert Patterson's wartime service and the impact of the foundation established in his honor. "Your father's legacy has grown far beyond what any of us could have imagined," James said during his dedication speech. "From a young soldier who saved lives in Vietnam, to a craftsman who preserved traditional skills, to a father whose reunion with his son sparked a movement that's reunited dozens of families. Robert Patterson's life exemplifies the very best of American values." Marcus spoke last at the ceremony, standing before the crowd with Eleanor beside him and the wooden cross Arthur Brennan had carried for 50 years in his pocket. "2.5 years ago, I was just a man who fixed elevators," Marcus began. "I thought I knew who I was and where I belonged. Then one night, an emergency call changed everything. I learned that I was a son who'd been lost and found again. I discovered that my father was a hero who never needed recognition, and I realized that the most important thing we can do with our lives is to build something that will outlast us." Gestured toward the new training center, where the sounds of construction work could be heard as volunteers put finishing touches on the interior spaces. "This building represents more than just a place to learn trades," Marcus continued. "It represents the idea that broken things can be fixed, that lost people can find their way home, and that one person's courage can inspire generations of positive change." The ceremony concluded with the unveiling of a bronze plaque near the center's entrance. It read, "The Arthur Brennan Memorial Center. Dedicated to the memory of Arthur Brennan, 1930-2023, and in honor of Robert James Patterson, 1949 to 2025. Two soldiers whose friendship transcended war and whose legacy builds hope for future generations. Most important work a man can do is building a life with the people he loves. Robert James Patterson." As the crowd dispersed and the sun set over the Portland skyline, Marcus found himself alone in the original workshop where this journey had begun. The space had evolved considerably since that first day when Robert had shown him the child-sized workbench. But the essence remained the same, a place where broken things could be made whole again. Eleanor joined him in the quiet workshop, carrying 2 cups of coffee as she had every morning for the past 2 years. "What are you thinking about?" she asked, settling into her familiar chair. Marcus picked up a piece of oak he'd been considering for his next project. Rocking chair that would eventually sit in the Memorial Center's lobby, available for anyone who needed a moment of peace and reflection. "I'm thinking about connections," Marcus said. How Dad's courage in Vietnam connected him to Arthur Brennan. How our reunion connected me to you and to all those other separated families. How this workshop connects young people to skills they can use for a lifetime. Eleanor nodded thoughtfully. Robert always believed that everything was connected somehow. He used to say that every piece of wood in a project had to work together, even if they came from different trees. Marcus began sketching design ideas for the rocking chair, his mind already visualizing the curves and joints that would make it both beautiful and functional. Somewhere in the distance, he could hear the sounds of students working in the basement classroom, their voices mixing with the familiar sounds of sawing and hammering. I think Dad would be proud of what we've built here, Marcus said.
I know.
He would, Eleanor replied. But more than that, I think he'd be proud of the man you've become. The man who answered that emergency call and stayed to help a stranger. The man who used his own story to help other families heal. The man who's carrying forward a tradition of building things that matter. As Marcus worked on his design sketches, he reflected on the extraordinary chain of events that had brought him to this moment. A broken elevator at 2 a.m. had led to finding his parents, which had led to uncovering a larger tragedy, which had led to reuniting multiple families, which had led to building an institution that would help people for generations to come. Sometimes the most important journeys begin with the simplest act of service. Answering a call for help in the middle of the night and staying until the job is done right. The workshop around him hummed with the energy of creation and learning, filled with the sounds of people building things that would outlast them all. And in that sound, Marcus could hear the echo of his father's voice. Still teaching, still guiding, still proving that love and skill and patience can overcome any obstacle. The missing piece had not only found its place, it had become the cornerstone of something larger and more meaningful than anyone could have imagined. 5 years after that life-changing elevator repair, Marcus stood at the podium of the National Association of Vocational Educators, addressing an audience of over 1,000 professionals from across the country. The conference was being held in Denver. Through the convention center's massive windows, he could see the Rocky Mountains stretching toward the horizon. When I was 32 years old, Marcus began, I thought I knew exactly who I was. I was Marcus Thompson, an elevator technician with a successful emergency repair business. I lived alone, worked alone, and expected to continue that way indefinitely. Then I received a call at 2:17 a.m. that taught me everything I thought I knew. About my life was incomplete. The audience was rapt with attention as Marcus shared his story, the broken elevator, the mysterious woman, the reunion that changed everything. But this wasn't the same story he'd told dozens of times to reporters and investigators. This version focused on something different. The transformative power of skilled work and the responsibility that comes with carrying forward tradition. The Patterson-Brennan Foundation has now graduated over 800 students from our various programs, Marcus continued. These aren't just numbers, they're individuals who discovered they had capabilities they never knew existed. They're young people who found direction, veterans who found purpose, adults who found new careers when their old ones disappeared. In the audience, Marcus spotted familiar faces. Janet Rodriguez, now the Foundation's Director of Curriculum Development, sat in the front row. Beside her was Tom Chen, a former gang member who'd graduated from their first class and now managed the metalworking program. Sarah Mitchell had flown in from her new position as Director of Family Reunification Services, a program that had grown out of their original investigation. What Marcus didn't mention in his speech was the personal milestone he'd reached just that morning. Before leaving for Denver, he'd received confirmation that the legal process of officially changing his name was complete. Marcus Thompson no longer existed in any government database. He was now, formally and permanently, David Marcus Patterson, name his parents had given him 35 years earlier. After his presentation, Marcus was approached by Dr. Elena Rodriguez from the Department of Education. She was a woman in her 50s with an infectious enthusiasm for innovative educational programs. Mr. Patterson, I've been following your foundation's work for the past 2 years, she said. We're developing a new federal initiative to support vocational training programs, and we'd like the Patterson-Brennan model to be one of our flagship examples. The conversation that followed would prove to be another turning point. Dr. Rodriguez explained that the federal government was planning to invest $50 million in vocational education programs that demonstrated measurable success in job placement and community impact. Your foundation checks every box we're looking for, she said. High graduation rates, excellent job placement statistics, community partnerships, and most importantly, evidence of real-life transformation. Marcus felt overwhelmed by the scope of what she was proposing. Federal funding would allow them to replicate their model in cities across the country, potentially helping thousands of people discover the satisfaction of skilled work. That evening, as Marcus walked through downtown Denver's bustling streets, his phone rang. Eleanor's voice was excited, almost breathless. "Marcus, you need to come home immediately," she said. "Something incredible has happened." "What's wrong? Are you okay?" "I'm fine, but we've received a letter that changes everything." "There's a woman who says she's Robert's daughter?" Marcus stopped walking, nearly dropping his phone. "What do you mean, Robert's daughter?" "Her name is Catherine Patterson Walsh. She says Robert is her biological father, and she's been searching for him for 20 years. The flight back to Portland was the longest 3 hours of Marcus's life. Eleanor met him at the airport with a manila envelope containing documents that would shatter and rebuild their understanding of Robert's life once. Again, Catherine Patterson Walsh was 58 years old, a successful architect living in San Diego. Her letter, written in careful, precise handwriting, told a story that neither Marcus nor Eleanor had ever suspected. "I was born in 1967 to Robert Patterson and Maria Santos," the letter began. "My mother was 19, Robert was 18. They were both working construction in Ohio when they met. Robert wanted to marry my mother, but her family disapproved of the relationship and sent her to live with relatives in California." The letter continued with details that painted a picture of young Robert that neither Marcus nor Eleanor had ever imagined. Before Vietnam, before Eleanor, Ribera had fallen in love with a Mexican-American woman whose family's prejudices had torn them apart. "I was raised by my mother's sister in San Diego. My mother died when I was 12, and it wasn't until I was in my 30s that I learned Robert's full name and began searching for him. By then, he'd apparently disappeared into military service and a new life. Catherine had spent 2 decades hiring private investigators and searching public records. She'd discovered Robert's marriage to Eleanor and learned about Marcus's supposed death in 1993, but she'd never been able to locate them in Portland. I saw the news coverage about your foundation and realized that Robert Patterson, who served in Vietnam and became a woodworker, was the same man who was my father. I've been working up the courage to contact you for months." Eleanor was beside herself with excitement and confusion. "I had no idea Robert had another child. He never mentioned anyone named Maria Santos." Marcus studied the documents Catherine had included: birth certificates, hospital records, photographs of a young Robert that predated any pictures Eleanor had ever seen. The evidence was compelling and heartbreaking. "She wants to meet us," Eleanor said. "She's flying up from San Diego next week." Catherine Patterson Walsh arrived at Portland International Airport on a rainy Tuesday morning, carrying a leather portfolio and wearing the nervous expression of someone whose entire life was about to change. She was tall like Robert had been, with the same gentle eyes and careful way of moving through the world. The resemblance to Robert was unmistakable.
Ow.
But it was her hands that convinced Marcus beyond any doubt. They were craftsmen's hands, scarred and calloused from years of working with tools, but precise and gentle in their movements. "I'm an architect," Catherine explained as they drove toward the house, "but I specialize in restoration work. Buildings, historic structures that need to be preserved rather than replaced." Eleanor laughed through her tears. "You're your father's daughter?" "He always said it was more important to fix what was broken than to build something new." The reunion at the house was surreal. Catherine moved through the rooms like someone remembering a dream, touching surfaces and examining details with an architect's eye for craftsmanship. "He built all of this himself, didn't he?" she asked, running her hand along the custom millwork in the living room. "Every piece," Eleanor confirmed. "Even after he got sick, He was still adjusting details and making improvements. But it was the workshop that truly moved Catherine to tears. She stood in the doorway for several minutes, taking in the tools, the workbenches, the evidence of a lifetime spent creating beautiful things. "I can feel him here," she whispered. "I've been searching for my father for 20 years, and I can feel him in this room." Marcus showed her the child-sized workbench where he'd learned his first lessons. In craftsmanship, "He kept this waiting for me for 32 years, Marcus said. He never gave up hope." Catherine examined the small workbench with professional interest. "The joinery is perfect. Even for something designed for a child, he didn't compromise on quality." Over the next several days, Catherine shared her life story. She'd become an architect partly because working with her hands felt natural and necessary. She'd married young to a man named David Walsh, who'd supported her career and encouraged her search for her biological father. Grandchildren who were now in their 20s and pursuing careers in engineering and design. "I think Robert's influence flows through bloodlines," Catherine observed as she examined some of Marcus's recent woodworking projects. "Even separated by decades and distance, we all ended up working with our hands." Catherine's arrival brought unexpected practical benefits to the foundation. As a licensed architect with extensive experience in educational facility design, she was perfectly positioned to help plan the national expansion that Dr. Rodriguez had proposed. "You're going to need properly designed spaces in each location," Catherine explained as she reviewed their expansion plans. "The layout of a workshop affects everything: workflow, safety, efficiency, student engagement." Working together, Marcus and Catherine developed architectural standards for Patterson-Brennan. Training centers that incorporated everything Robert had taught about workspace design. Each facility would have the same attention to natural lighting, ventilation, and a tool organization that made the original workshop so effective. 6 months later, ground was broken on the first satellite location in Phoenix, with Sarah Mitchell serving as the local director. Catherine had designed a facility that honored the original workshop's principles while incorporating modern safety standards and accessibility features. The Phoenix Center's opening ceremony drew national media attention, partly because of the unique family story behind the foundation, but mostly because of the impressive job placement statistics their graduates achieved. 96% of Patterson-Brennan graduates found employment within 6 months of completion, and the average wage increase for career change students was 47%, standing at the Phoenix ceremony podium. Marcus looked out at an audience that included his extended family, Eleanor, and Catherine's children, who'd driven up from San Diego for the event. Also present were dozens of graduates from the original Portland program, including Tom Chen, who'd been hired to help establish the metalworking curriculum in Phoenix. 5 years ago, Marcus said, "I learned that fixing broken things requires more than technical skill. It requires patience, love, and the willingness to invest whatever time is necessary to make something whole again." The same principles apply to fixing broken lives, broken families, and broken communities. Gestured toward the new facility behind him. "This building represents our commitment to fixing what's broken in our approach to education and career training. We're not just teaching people to work with their hands, we're helping them discover capabilities they never knew they possessed." The audience, Marcus spotted Janet Walsh, the building manager from Riverside Towers, whose emergency call had started this entire journey. She'd driven down from Portland specifically for the ceremony, bringing with her a surprise that would cap the evening perfectly after the formal presentations concluded. Janet approached Marcus with a small wrapped package. "I've been saving this for the right moment," she said. "I thought tonight might be that moment." Inside the package was a brass nameplate that read Marcus Thompson Emergency Elevator Services, along with a handwritten note. "Thank you for answering the call and staying until the job was done right. The management and residents of Riverside Towers. We had this made for you right after that night," Janet explained. "We were going to give it to you the next time you came for routine maintenance, but then you closed your business and we lost track of you." Marcus held the nameplate, thinking about the man he'd been 5 years earlier. Competent, independent, but incomplete in ways he hadn't understood. Marcus Thompson had answered an emergency call because it was his job. David Marcus Patterson had stayed to help because it was his nature. As the evening wound down and the crowd dispersed, Marcus found himself alone with Catherine in the new workshop space. She was examining the workbenches with the critical eye of someone who understood both form and function. "He would be so proud," Catherine said quietly, "not just of what you've built, but of who you've become." "We've built," Marcus corrected. "This is a family legacy now, Robert's children carrying forward his values." Catherine smiled. "I like the sound of that, Robert's children." As they prepared to leave the workshop, Catherine noticed something that made her pause. Mounted on the wall near the main entrance was a simple wooden frame containing the original emergency service call slipped from Riverside Towers dated 5 years earlier. "Why did you keep that?" she asked. Marcus looked at the faded piece of paper. "That had changed everything, because it reminds me that the most important work we do usually starts with someone asking for help. And the difference between a job and a calling is whether you stay until the real work is finished." Outside, the Phoenix skyline glittered under a canopy of stars. In Portland, Eleanor was probably sitting in the original workshop, knitting and listening to the sounds of evening students learning to transform raw materials into objects of beauty and utility. In cities across the country, similar workshops would soon be opening, carrying forward Robert's belief that broken things could always be repaired by patient hands and loving hearts. Marcus Patterson, no longer Thompson, toward his rental car with his sister beside him, discussing plans for the next expansion, the next group of students. The next opportunity to prove that answering a call for help in the middle of the night can change not just one life, but hundreds. The elevator had been fixed years ago, but the real repair work healing separated families, building hopeful futures, preserving traditions that connected past and future, that work would continue for generations. Some emergency calls never really end. They just expand into something larger than anyone could have imagined when they first picked up the phone and said, "How can I help?" Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. And check them out. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.